Much in our profession of music teaching has to be taught with a top-down approach. There's just no way around it. We have to be that kind of leader to teach our kids. There's no question about it. But there is much room for encouraging the application of this knowledge in a constructivist way. So if there's one thing, folks, I hope that you take away from me today, is that we are all stewards of music, and we understand how technical aspects of music have to be imbued in our teaching. We have a big agenda when we're working with kids, whether it's in the classroom or the studio, rehearsal. We have a mission, we have a lot of pressures on us, parents, so forth. And we think we have the pathways designed, and we try to make them better all the time. But I want to argue that a little bit of that needs to be relaxed some for us to welcome in the student voice. Welcome in a student to be able to be playful with the music a bit in their own particular way. Or even to say to the student, I think it's time for you to kind of bring a piece that you've done for me into the studio next week. And I'm not arguing that this should be the dominant way we teach, because you can't be creative with music unless you have something to be creative with, which is what we are able to give them. But what I want to ask that you consider a little bit as you leave the session might be, how can I make just a little more room in the way I work with my kids to allow for this imaginative otherness in the student to be able to be celebrated? Many of you may do this already. I don't know that all of you do. Some of you may not do it at all. But just to recognize that there is this world of musical understanding and peopleness about the aspect of working with our art that we need to celebrate. And I hope that we would think about that in combination. So I would argue then with that third point, students must learn to think in and about sound in ways that end up in independent thinking. I would like us to be redundant when the students leave us, in the sense that we no longer are really needed by them because they've developed as much musical independence as they possibly can. I think that's the mark. I think that's the mark of great teaching, when our students leave us with the kind of platform and independence where they can begin to make aesthetic decisions with having been gone through our work. So I think we all want that. We sometimes don't nourish it, and I'd like us to think of ways that we can nourish it a little bit more. That doesn't mean students come back and hug us and make us, we're important in their lives, they love us and all of that, but they love us and hug us because they've been given the tools to be able to make their profession or their world, the humanness happen with our help. And I think a lot of that has to do with figuring out how to let students make their own way with our guidance. So that's what I sort of believe in deeply in terms of music teaching and learning. I don't think we tell our stakeholders, our principals, the people parents who work, I don't think we tell them that enough. I don't think we make it clear to them that that's our goal, is to give them this kind of independent thinking. I think they think that we're going to just be sort of very, very strong disciplinarians and beat the music into them, that kind of thing. I think we need to round them out a little bit and make them a little clearer. So this last bullet, less emphasis on covering large amounts of information quickly and less information more thoroughly. I'm a big fan, when I talk to my music history colleagues at USC or Northwestern or wherever, about the idea of reforming the way we teach Western art music. I don't know if you remember, but it was like 4 semesters, and it was like, you know, maybe the Renaissance or maybe even the early music, medieval times through the modern times. Over those 4 semesters, maybe there was a dropped-a-needle thing. There was a lot of music we listened to. There's something to be said for that, being introduced to large bodies of information. But the downside for that is that you walk away with maybe not as much depth of knowledge that help us deal with our musical understandings in years to come. So there's a big part of me that says that the music history sequence in a college and university needs to be completely redone, so that we may not get to every Beethoven string quartet or every Mozart symphony, but we get depth into something close to that, so that the understanding of the music, the historical importance of the music, can be then followed through in a career later on. That same principle, I'm picking on history here, but that same principle is the piano literature classes. It seems to me that, you know, if we make everybody sort of deal with a large body of information in a short period of time, it's likely they will not remember lots of things, but if there are a few things that we can pick out that can really work, makes a lot of sense. So this idea of less mass and more depth, I think, is a good thing that we can take away from the philosophy of what we're doing. So I talk a lot about creativity and creativeness, and so here's the best definition I've ever seen. I've seen maybe 55 to 100 definitions of creativity in various books, modern. But these two psychologists, Plunker, actually three, Beghetto and Dow, came up with this fairly succinct and I think pretty all-encompassing definition. These slides are all in the handouts that I put up on the server, so you can download the whole presentation so you don't have to feel like you have to write all this down. Creativity is the interaction among aptitude, that's the potential for something, process, that is, to be able to work with something like an art piece or a music piece, and the environment by which an individual or group, and this business here, individual and group, is exceedingly important these days because we're finding out that creativeness often doesn't happen in an individual only. It's part of a group process. Keith Sawyer writes a book called Explaining Creativity. I use it as a textbook, and he's adamant about the fact that creativeness is best thought of as a group activity, a collaborative kind of thing. I always remind him that there's a lot of room for the individualist, however, and he understands that. He's a musician, he's a jazz player, he understands that kind of stuff. But he will always come back to me and say, yeah, I know individuals have a lot of creativity, but it's a lot of the creative things have happened because of group interaction. So when a composer creates a piece, it's his or her interaction with musicians who are playing the music, audiences that are responding to it that might give the creative process a kind of movement ahead. So that's an important point, both individual and group. It kind of blows away the myth that creativity is an individual kind of thing. And I think it is, but I think it isn't in some ways. It's more of a group thing. It has a lot of implications for studio teaching then. Studio classes where people talk to each other, ways in which we can do dual lessons or have trio lessons, something like that, where some musical problem is dealt with in a kind of a community. Important idea. Perceptible product. I don't believe there's any creativeness unless there's some kind of product at the end. Otherwise, it's just daydreaming, right? And it's both novel and useful. That is, there's something unusual, kind of unique about it, and it's also useful as defined within a social context. That's harder to deal with. Artists over the years have been sort of really out there in their work and are not recognized in their time and are recognized years later. So sometimes that last one is a problem as being kind of useful within a social context because it might be seen that something is so bizarre it's not useful. So that's a problem necessarily with the definition. But most of them have that as a kind of basis. So I've tried to capture all of this in my own work with this kind of model, and I don't want to bore you with it, but the idea is there is this kind of divergent and convergent thinking thing going on during the creative process where skills are aptitudes, conceptual understanding, craftsmanship, and our aesthetic sensitivity, and the conditions under which it happens. And it moves from the intention down to the product. It's not a mysterious process, this creativity thing. It's very, very, very clear. I mean, it's messy, and it's hard to describe, and you talk to a composer or a performer about how they're interpreting work and so forth, and it's hard for them to put it into words, but it is very plottable, and you can actually figure it out and have it make it work. I really believe that there's this kind of time away thing. People call it incubation, where you're away from a problem. So one takeaway from the creativity literature, and you can pass it on to your students, is that if they're working on a recital or a project, the idea of starting early and then giving some time off and coming back to it is enormously powerful in the literature. That means that they are able somehow to psychologically become aware, and that working up at the last minute for something will probably result in a performance that's poor. But a performance that starts earlier and there's time away from it while things are coming back to it, there's a lot of meaning for that. So creative thinking is this, in the arts, is for me a dynamic process, mental process, alternating between divergent and convergent thinking and moving in stages over time. It's enabled by internal musical skills and outside conditions and results in a final musical product which is new for the creator. So I want to go over this background just to set a platform for my argument that as we are working with kids in studios or rehearsals or in classrooms, as we're working with people learning something, I believe that real learning happens when there is this opportunity to celebrate the thinking with convergent and divergent stuff. So what does this mean? Well, a little quick preview. It seems to me that it's perfectly legitimate for us to say, well, now, I really love the way you played that phrase and stuff. Can you think of two other ways that it could be played that are completely different? What do you mean? Well, it says in the music it should be soft, it gets louder. Well, let's not do it that way. Let's try it with reversing it. Let's try to play it loud here and then get soft. I don't like it that way. Well, okay, that's because you're used to it the other way, and that's because you're looking at the score, but let's just try it and see if it... So the idea of entertaining fancifully different ways of dealing with the musical world that we live in opens up the possibilities for divergency and independent thought. It's an opportunity for us to be able to say, I'm not going to say much about this piece. I'd like you to sort of take it home, think about it, work with it, and I'd like to have you come back and see what kind of interpretation you have of how this piece works. I want to hear your ideas about it before we sort of talk about other ideas. Or, here are 5 recordings of this prelude. Short recordings. They're all extremely different in their style. I'd like you to go home, listen to these interpretations, and then come back and we'll talk a little bit about what you liked or didn't like or what you thought was unusual about these 5 ways. We somehow have gotten to the point where we don't want kids necessarily to be influenced by other people's work, but I kind of feel like we ought to be able to give them lots of ways ahead of time of how to listen to that and to come up with some kind of general opinion that they would like to do. Actors do this. My son's an actor. Looking at Macbeth and looking at Shakespeare, look at many, many different interpretations of various important roles and try to get a feeling of where you center yourself in those interpretations. Ultimately, as educators in the arts, we are successful if we engage our students in thinking about the core of our art forms by blending imaginative thought with mastery of skills and knowledge. Blending imaginative thought with the mastery of skills and knowledge, I think, is the key to all of this. So here is a question for you. It'll come back again at the end of my talk. And it's one that I ask all the time to my students. As you're driving home in the evening, as you're thinking about your day, as you're imagining your role as a teacher, have I maximized the opportunities for all of my learners to make their own aesthetic decisions with my guidance and encouragement? Have I given an opportunity for students overall to be able to have the chance to define what they want to say? You might say, wait a minute, Webster, these people don't know how to make an aesthetic decision. They haven't gotten the skills yet. Yes, but they do have some skills, and they do have some ability to kind of make decisions at this point. Every learner does, no matter where they are. So it's not that the idea is to wait until all the skills have been learned in order to turn them free to make aesthetic decisions. I want to say that again. It's not the idea that we wait until all of the technical skills are known before we feel comfortable in giving students a chance to express. I feel it has to happen in day one, that we give children an opportunity to express themselves no matter how crude they may have in their fingers and in tongues, lips, whatever they're playing. I think as a young trumpet player, for instance, begins to learn to play the trumpet, by putting a piece of notation in front of them and teaching them notation at the same time is wrong. I really feel we need to give them the time to explore the instrument and the sound that it makes, and to have them create tunes by themselves that they know with their trumpet, with only the very littlest of experience at the very first time, and that be a mantra that goes through the way we teach music from the very little to the very old. Always an opportunity for students to have their voice in the way that we're teaching them, and allow them to say, well, I don't know how to do that, can you teach me? Yes. They're motivated now to hear what we have to say because it's growing out of themselves more internally. It's not taken down from them amazingly. All right, so that's the base. That's the thing I have spent my life thinking about. The idea of taking a cue from the creativity literature and finding a way that we bring people into the art with the idea of blending both the mastery and the fancifulness of what our art happens to be.